Hello and welcome to another Michigan Virtual webinar. I'm Dr. Chris Harrington, and today I'm going to lead a conversation with some of the team here at Michigan Virtual that's focused on what school leaders should consider when planning to leap to remote teaching and learning during extended school closures. During this session, we'll discuss 7 core areas of teaching and learning that are directly related to a readiness rubric, which is available for download at the Michigan Virtual website. This particular readiness rubric has 9 particular topics. However, our conversation today is really going to focus on some critical areas that we've kind of clustered some of these items or topics in the readiness rubric. We've clustered them to allow for a different kind of a conversation that shows the interrelatedness of all these different topics that school leaders will need to consider as they're planning that shift to remote learning. Specifically, the critical areas will be around the areas of technology, curriculum, teaching, accommodations for learners who need them, professional learning, leadership, and communications. Our panelists here today are from Michigan Virtual, and we have Jamey Fitzpatrick, who's the president and CEO. We have Shannon Smith, who's our director of student learning services. We have Stacey Schuh, the director of professional learning services. We're joined also by Dave Richards, who's the president of Core to Edge and former superintendent in Michigan. And of course, Chris Harrington, as I mentioned before, and I'm the director of Michigan Virtual Learning Research Institute. At this time, I'd like to turn over to Jamey Fitzpatrick, who again is the president and CEO of Michigan Virtual. And Jamey, if you could you please talk to us a little bit about why we developed the rubric, the readiness rubric, and how we hope school leaders could use the rubric as they begin planning for extended school closures?
Yeah, Chris, I'd be happy to. I think everybody realizes that the mandatory closures that we're experiencing throughout the state is causing everyone to reevaluate how educational services are delivered here in Michigan. We believe that all schools at some point will need to explore remote learning days more going forward than they have in the past. You know, last year it was the Arctic blast that closed most Michigan schools for 2 or 3 weeks. This year it's the coronavirus. We just saw the southern states ravaged by tornadoes that caused school closures there. Next year it'll likely be something else, but it's good policy to explore remote learning. And we created the rubric to really help schools think about the top 9 planning considerations to explore as they think about creating learning opportunities for students who are remote. Our goal was to keep the rubric simple, keep it to 1 page, and help school leaders easily gauge kind of where they are in terms of their own capacity and what areas for development they may need to explore. You know, the rubric really does only represent one asset, part of a larger collection of planning resources that we're providing to schools during this extraordinary time. And I would like to just conclude by saying that we'd like to encourage all education leaders to ask for help and identify other resources that they need to move forward. We've made this a priority for the organization, and we're going to be doing everything we can to help Michigan schools build capacity to provide learning opportunities for students who are not attending school. Chris, back to you.
Thank you, Jamey. So let's take a closer look at this readiness rubric. So what you can see here, there are 9 columns or 9 topics across the top of the document that include some areas where school leaders need to be mindful as they begin learning continuity planning. There's also some language within each of the columns that helps any users or readers of the document better understand what the topic entails and how school leaders can assess at a high level where their school district is in terms of being ready to shift to teaching and learning in a remote format. For our conversation today, like I mentioned, we're going to cluster some of these columns together to speak in a more interrelated way about the topics. But please note that the link at the bottom of this document or the bottom of this screen is where you can go to download the readiness rubric. Okay, it's free for download. It's on the Michigan Virtual website. So to start off the conversation, I wanted to talk about curriculum resources. And when we think about students learning in a remote environment, like in their homes, one of the first things that most of us think about are what materials and what kind of content will students need to be able to learn effectively. What can our schools or teachers do to gather and organize content to provide thoughtful experiences for students? We have extensive experience sitting around the table here, the virtual table, of course, in this area, and we have some learned lessons along the way. So my question to the panelists is, what kind of challenges might schools experience? How could they gather or develop curricular resources, and what kind of challenges might they experience? Any thoughts?
I would say the first step is to gather the expertise that you have already available to you in your school. Your teachers have expertise in defining what is the appropriate content to provide for students. The challenge could be mindset. Are we ready to move from a more traditional format of teaching to a pattern that allows for more flexibility, a little different kind of balance in the school day for a student?
Yeah, I would also say, I think it's really important to keep the context of where the district is at currently in their implementation of remote learning resources for kids. I think ideally, if they have a learning management system that's already in place, I think those districts are going to have an easier transition than one that's going to be starting from basically ground zero in trying to build the resources. I really see a lot of districts currently looking to leverage their district websites to make it 2 clicks or less for parents to find access to resources, connections to grade level content. So I think that it's really in the scope of the local district, understanding where they're at, and then how can they bridge that gap, that learning gap for students.
I think Shannon hit it on the nose when she said, talk to your educators, talk to those teachers. They probably already have content that they can use with students. I also think that a number of teachers have dabbled in blended learning in their classrooms. So that might be a Google Classroom or a Seesaw tool. And so I think there's a lot of those content resources out there. And so get with your staff, talk to them, see what they're already doing, and then make a plan.
It's interesting too, is that you really see a lot of districts where they'll have a lead teacher, it could be a department head at the secondary level, where that person will act as the point person as far as curating and vetting through resources. And that's true whether it was just with snow days or any kind of breaks in learning that were unexpected or not on the school calendar. And those people serve as almost a train the trainer model where they will connect their colleagues to content as well, so that everyone's not trying to do this alone. I think districts really leverage their professional learning communities at times like this as well, to where they can look at the sharing of resources, assessment practices, whether it's formative or summative, just really connecting them to not starting over in the work, but continuation of the work that they've been doing.
And it's important to determine the context. So are you going to be focusing on enrichment? Are you going to be focusing on core content? There's all kinds of resources available providing enrichment opportunities. Commonly see virtual field trips and museum visits. If you're focused more on the core content, Michigan has the Open Book Project that's specifically focused on social studies, but there's lots of other resources out there to support development in an online environment.
To add on to the Michigan Open Book Project, the state of Michigan also has just a plethora of resources on their Go Open Michigan website, which all is curated by educators, and it's open content for redevelopment, remixing, reusing. And so that link is goopenmichigan.org, and that's a wonderful resource.
Great, thank you. So let's shift a little bit and let's talk about some technology, because some of the resources that we were talking about, while not always needing to be technology-based, we did talk about some digital content that's available. And to a large extent, I think that's what schools are relying on in order to be able to promote some deeply effective teaching and learning in a remote setting. So we referenced technology a few times, and we also know that there's a certain level of technology that's going to be needed in order for schools to be successful in remote learning. What are your thoughts on technologies schools need, and what practices do you think schools should implement to support technology to end users And that means not only students, but also to the adults, the teachers or instructional staff within the school district.
I would say from a district perspective, one of the opportunities is to really understand what your community and where do they stand in regards to access. I think equity really plays into this in regards to poverty and students who may or may not have easy access to the technology. So you have to remain sensitive to that. Bandwidth is a big deal. You have to have the bandwidth to be able to handle the multimedia and the amount of streaming that would come through with media-rich resources that a teacher may want to share with them. In a perfect scenario, a district is a mature one-to-one environment where kids are comfortable with the technology, parents are comfortable accessing the district learning portal. So without that though, I think that you're really looking at mobile devices. So whatever tools you're using, you really have to make sure that they'll adapt to whatever the mobile device is, whether it's a smartphone, iPad, all the way up to a laptop, desktop environment.
And not only training for the educators and letting the parents know about what the kids are doing, but I think we have this idea that kids all know technology already, so there's no need to walk them through it. And I think, yes, kids are exposed to more technology than maybe we were in the past, but they're not necessarily using it for the purposes we would like them to, for educational purposes. And so keeping that in mind and really being cognizant of the fact that we need to walk them through what good learning looks like online and not take for granted that they already know.
It's a really powerful point, Stacey. They may be digital natives, but not educational digital natives. I think in addition to the technologies that Dave outlined, having a device to use, you want to think about how you're going to engage those students. So do they have a webcam? Do they have a microphone that's embedded in the resources that they're utilizing? Because that's going to make a difference in the tools that you can provide and connect with your students on.
You know, a big part of this, I would just like to add, is that you almost have to design for the lowest common denominator. And that's, again, that you have to be very tuned into your community, your students, and what they have access to. So if you know that a high percentage of your students do not have access at home, if you're not able to equip them with a mobile device to take home, then it's really about, are there hotspots in the community that will still be open? Are there resources that are available through, public areas that they could access, terminals, local library, whatever that may be. But you have to design for that smallest common denominator, and that means that you can't always use some of those high-end resources that you were able to do in a technology-rich classroom as well.
Hey, Dave, that's a really important point. I'm just curious, given your technology background, where do you see the role of a learning management system as it relates to school districts statewide? I'm not sure I know what the percentage is that actually make use of them today, but if you were to put the level of importance on an LMS, would it be the center of the bullseye? Would it be what people grow from? Or is it more subject to the grade level of the school that you're trying to work with?
Well, I think it really depends upon the school district. I don't think that the robust implementation of LMS is where we would want it to be at this point. However, I think that it serves the role as a central repository for instruction or resources, as kids become more and more comfortable accessing an LMS and teachers are more comfortable with putting assessments in there and checking for understanding with kids using the online environment. I think you really see that the comfort level extends well beyond the regular school day. So first and foremost, if an LMS is available, I think it's a huge advantage for a school district during breaks in learning. If it's not there, then I think you really have to be intentional. And this is where central office really needs to step up, to be intentional around saying, we don't need to be a mile wide and an inch deep. Let's do a couple of things really well. And if there are apps that we're comfortable with, depending upon grade level or grade band levels, let's leverage those rather than trying to bring the latest and greatest to the market, to our learning community, when it's going to be more disruptive than it is helpful.
Dave, would you also say that when you're looking at a learning management system or LMS, that there are a variety of levels to look at, that you can start, Google Classrooms can function as an LMS. We don't have to people don't have to feel like they have to go and purchase substantial, robust levels of LMS to be able to provide these services, correct?
Absolutely. And again, it really has to be reflective of the local learning community. If you are trying to all of a sudden roll out all the technology and all the software resources to try to bridge this gap, it may cause more anxiety, more concern, and more confusion for both the parents, the kids, as well as the staff, than if you were simply continue on with resources that you have available to you within the district already.
And speaking to that point, Dave, as a parent in this space right now, I really appreciate that the district my kids attend has picked, this is the platform we're going to use for elementary. This is the platform we're going to use for high school. And like Shannon pointed out, it doesn't have to be a robust, true LMS, but all being on the same page with those communications to parents around this is what we're going to use at this time is really important and beneficial.
I think the last point I would make on technology, Chris, I'm imagining you want to move on. But the last point I would make is that you want to think about all of the support personnel or support staff that you have in the school in order to help provide support in technology to students. So when you're thinking about training, don't just train your teachers, train your librarians, your paraprofessionals, all of the individuals that could be available to support students, because when you are in a situation where you are, as we're seeing currently, forced to go into more of a remote option, that just gives you a wealth of people that are available to help support and answer student questions and parent questions if they have that background in that training.
I would agree completely, Shannon. I think, my hat, the superintendent hat, went on immediately, and I started thinking about who's on the team, who's on the bench that could provide remote support during this time. And that's every person in the building who already does tier 1, tier 2 support, whether it's the media specialists, parapro, building secretaries, anyone who is tech savvy, instructional coaches. We always had a model where we almost had a genius bar in every building, and it was staffed by kids. And that was K-12 within the school district. There are ways that you can work out scenarios for those kids to provide support during this time as well to their peers. And it's really being creative. One of the questions that we have is necessary levels of technical support to remote students and teachers. It's being creative about that and saying, how are we better together on a larger scale? And then you can break that down into tier 1, tier 2. This is the team that's going to handle that. Tier 3 and tier 4, we need to have our tech staff, because folks need to have someone quickly, 2 clicks or less, or one quick phone call where they can get their problem solved. Otherwise, there's a give up factor that will kick in with this level of disruption.
That's an excellent point, Dave. And as a former technology director, it's not an easy way for a technology department of a traditional brick and mortar school to think, because now in a remote learning environment, you may have all of your students and staff remote, or maybe a large portion of them. You need to think a little bit differently about how you provide that support. And as a school leader, I think that's something that you need to have that very real conversation with your technology department about what's realistic, what can we do, and how do we get creative about solving these problems and challenges.
Yeah, in a school scenario, you can go to all of a sudden 5,000 remote workers in one day. How are we going to support them? And that's the lens that you have to think through to keep kids connected.
Absolutely. And Shannon, to your point, yeah, we could talk probably for about an hour on each one of these topics, right? Maybe some individual webinars about each topic would be appropriate. But let's shift. So when we talk about schools moving to a remote learning model that makes heavy use of technology, as we've been discussing, and a lot of times schools refer to this as digital learning. Both the learning environment and the practice of teaching feels very different from a traditional face-to-face classroom environment. So as school leaders plan for this shift, what should they be aware of with respect to the differences of teaching remotely with technology and some possible strategies teachers can use to effectively teach in that remote environment?
Chris, this is an area that I feel passionately about, mainly because this is what I do on a daily basis. I think one of the most important things that I hear is, oh, we can take our day and just transition it into a online version of our day. So students will go to first hour from 8 to 8:50, and they'll go to second hour from 9 o'clock to 9:50. And I would encourage school leaders to think a little bit differently about how that schedule might be able to be modeled in an online environment. It is not a format that lends itself to students sitting in front of a computer for 6 hours a day and comfortably learning and actually integrating that knowledge into their own schema. So I want to encourage leaders to thinking about how they can schedule intentionally, providing multiple breaks, multiple opportunities for engagement, encouraging personalization for students so that they really can find ways to use that information and integrate it into their learning.
So a lot of times when I talk to teachers who have gone from teaching in a face-to-face classroom to teaching in an online space, when you ask them what is the most important thing for you if you're in a face-to-face classroom, they say building relationships. And so you want to keep that piece. That piece shouldn't go away because you're teaching online. So you really have to consider, how are you building these relationships with students? How are you providing them meaningful feedback? How are you checking in with them to make sure that their needs are being met outside the classroom? And I think those are things that sometimes we forget when we think about being in an online space, and we really need to come back to people are people are people, and we need to build relationships with kids. And that looks a little differently online. It's still possible, but it requires a different take on things.
I would encourage being intentional with your communications so that you can develop those relationships. Integrating humor, even if you're not a very funny person or normally very humorous in your class. Trying to find ways to share personal connections that may not feel as obvious. This is a great time for your dog to be in the video so that your students can continue to feel that warmth and connection, or encourage your students to share personal things that what does their online or remote space look like that they can talk about. The other area that I find teachers move from traditional to virtual teaching to be a challenge is tone. When you communicate strictly through written communication, if you're doing a lot of email or texting, you really need to think about how an adolescent or even a younger student is going to read that and understand that. And maybe you just want to get a message across quickly and efficiently, and it comes across being scary and mean, and now they think you don't like them because you're just trying to get information out quickly. So tone is another really important area to work on developing as you're teaching in this kind of fashion.
I think too, modeling vulnerability in this space. So I know when I first started putting more of my work online for students, I would take videos, but I would need to fix that video about 8 or 9 times before I was ready to put it out. And teachers just don't have time to do that. So to realize that, hey, it's not going to be perfect, and that kids don't need to see it perfect. They need to see what it looks like for things to go off the rails. They need you to model for them how to handle that situation. So I think that's really important too.
It's a really good point, Stacey, that trying to provide balance. Teachers and students need balance. You don't want a teacher spending 4 hours to create a 30-minute video. And teachers do that because they want it to be right and they want it to be perfect. So as school leaders, if we can provide them with that grace and that option to fail forward and learn and grow, that I think is going to be very helpful for them.
That's great. That's excellent stuff. Let's take that one step further, shall we? So we know that teaching and learning looks different and feels different in a remote environment, right? So let's talk now about accommodations. Okay, I think we can all agree that providing accommodations to students who need them can be challenging in a face-to-face environment, and that's an environment that we're already comfortable with. So how is providing accommodations for students different in a remote environment? And specifically, what types of challenges could instructional and support staff in this area, what kind of challenges would they experience, and how can school leaders support this kind of a process?
It's a matter of looking at it from a slightly different perspective. So a lot of the common accommodations that we see on IEPs can be provided in a remote setting. It's very common to see extended time on tests. It's a very doable ask in a remote environment, and maybe even more flexible in a remote environment as compared to a traditional environment where a student may be moving from class to class, hour to hour. You also see opportunities to resubmit. Again, another one that is inherent to can be inherent to an online program. I think one of the areas that may be more challenging is like having to read directly one-on-one to a student, in that you can provide one-on-one opportunities to work with students to provide that accommodation. So there's a lot of opportunity in the remote environment to provide accommodations. It's just looking at it from a slightly different perspective. But one of the keys is making sure that everyone in the school environment and your parent community understands that we're all working on the same side. We're all working together to support that child learning. And we can't be kind of fighting with each other about how things work and how they aren't the same as a traditional setting, but how can we apply them in this setting? How can we make sure the students' needs are still met in this unique setting?
There are a number of accessibility resources out there that would be helpful. I think about the Chromebooks and how many different accessibility features Chromebook has. One thing that I see a lot in my role here at Michigan Virtual is, we have those who are working in professional development space who will put out a PDF of something. And the problem with the PDF is that a screen reader won't be able to read it. And so kind of being mindful of what you put out, you should really make sure that a screen reader can pick up the text you want it to pick up, and make sure that those accessibility items work with your content. And it seems like one extra step, but it's really necessary to reach all learners. And it's really important to think about all of your learners.
I would just say, as a district leader, it's always important to be mindful of every child in every opportunity, whether it's face-to-face or an online environment. There are a tremendous number of resources through assistive technology that's available. I mean, I think just about the power that I have seen with Dragon Speak and what it's been able to do for learners who just, a child with dyslexia can absolutely become paralyzed trying to write a paragraph. But if you let them speak it and let the software do the writing for them, all of a sudden now they find their voice and they're able to have the software translate for them. And then they can make the edits and repair things. I think it's a different mindset where you design around mobility and flexibility, and you look at the accommodations that are needed for that child and think about what are the tools and resources that we have available to us or that we need to add to make sure that this child has the same opportunity as every other one of their classmates. And I think that it's a design mindset, and it is a all means all mindset when you're getting into these environments for students with disabilities.
And teachers and administrators have a lot of resources through their local ISDs. There's probably a specialist on staff who could walk you through different ideas on how to make your online content more accessible. So just know that there are folks out there to support you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So let's talk about what are some of the things that can make all this a reality for teachers and support staff. So moving to a remote teaching and learning environment requires some changes in how we design instruction for students, right? And also how we engage with students and families. To help teachers and support personnel work effectively in this kind of a remote learning environment, what types of professional learning training is needed? And how can school leaders make this happen?
So this is my passion area. Being from the classroom, I've sat in a number of professional developments, which you'd call sit and guess. And they're required for me to sit there, listen to the speaker, and then I wouldn't ever apply anything I learned from that day. So I think it's really important when we think about moving in this space to provide quality professional development. And that can be a one-day face-to-face event, but then you also need to follow it up with continuous support and coaching to make sure those teachers are able to implement what they've learned from that day, and also giving them a space to share ideas and support one another. So that can look a lot of different ways, but I think having face-to-face, having blended, having online opportunities for teachers, having options for them, and also really modeling what it could look like remotely, and not trying to just simply say, here's the technology, now you run with it, good luck. It has to be really thoughtful in how you implement this technology. And what teachers really want is to see this type of learning in action. They want to see how this looks. They want to feel it for themselves. So provide them with opportunities that allow for that.
I think that experience, Stacey, that you mentioned, modeling for teachers, but even parents, the more that your community can be exposed to this kind of learning, it's a lot less scary when they have to support their students in that environment. So I think that's an excellent point.
I would tell you, as someone who's been tasked with providing professional development during a transformation process of a school district, one of the things that I heard over and over was the desire for it to be customized based upon their current skill set, and teachers want to have a personalized experience with their professional learning, no different than what we want to do for students. So the more that you can look at the ability to customize it based on where that teacher is at, so that it's relevant, it's meaningful, it really has to answer that question of what's in it for me, for the teacher. As Stacey and Shannon have said, anytime that you can have them model it, if they can experience an online class, see what it's like as a learner. And I'll just pick on Zoom in particular. I think Zoom is a powerful tool that we haven't really truly realized in education, how we can leverage that for professional learning as well as PLC work, for time with kids, that we can create groups and rooms for that work to continue. But that's a tool that if we train and people become comfortable with it, it's not going to be this disruptive, monumental task to implement it. And so as much as that can be transparent, the last piece I would really say is around instructional design, getting them comfortable with how do you check for understanding in an online environment versus in the classroom. So many teachers rely on physical indicators from a kid, facial expressions, or kids disengaged in the classroom to know whether or not a child is learning. You don't have that in an online environment every time. And so how will you check? What are some other tools and strategies that you can use in your classroom to still monitor and adjust learning as you go forward?
I also think, Dave, that when I think about administrators, I think it's really important, and I think you'll probably agree and have some stories to share yourself, but I think it's really important that administrators model this too. So show educators that you're taking a chance. It may not go perfectly the first time around. Be willing to model what it looks like. Put a staff meeting online. Have a Google Classroom for your staff to ask questions and to share content, and really be willing to take a chance and say, I'm trying this. This is what it looks like, and we're all in this together.
Stacey, that's a great point. And part of this is a culture question as well, is how do you create a culture where staff feel very comfortable in their own learning, taking risks and being comfortable saying, listen, we're going to fail forward. We're going to learn this together. I'm a firm believer and we did this in our district where our principals were our primary trainers for any new initiative within the building. They would partner with the instructional coach in the building, but they were in the front of the room, not in the back of the room.
That's fantastic information, highly relevant, highly valuable. Can we shift just a little bit and talk about this last particular bullet on the slide here? How can we help parents support their kids in an environment? And there is a professional learning perspective or aspect to this, I guess, because as educators or school leaders, we need to learn how to do this ourselves, right? But how do we help parents then understand how they can support their children in a remote learning environment?
So I would say that it's really important for parents to understand that online learning, as Shannon said, is not 8 hours sitting in front of the computer, listening to content and not engaging. That is not what it looks like. I also believe that for our younger students, as a parent of a kindergartner, I feel very strongly that online learning is something that they do when it makes the most sense. So not just using technology for technology's sake. And I would say that in the current space we're in right now, I can share a little a little lesson learned by me yesterday is that I had a full-on plan for them. They had every single hour of the day mapped out. And when you're working with kids at home, realize that it's different than being in school. You need to give yourself some grace and say, not everything is going to go the way it's planned, and they shouldn't be on there from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. And they need time to engage with each other and engage with things offline. And so as a parent, I would just really in this time say, it's going to look different than maybe what you're envisioning in your head. It is not the true traditional model of school that you have. So just be flexible and just know that you're doing the best you can and it will be fine.
I think as school leaders, we also need to provide parents with clear guidance, outlining what our plan is sooner than later. Especially in times of emergency when we have to make quick decisions. Parents are eager and waiting to hear from us as to what we envision students will be doing during that time. So giving them some clear guidance. I think to Stacey's point, giving them that grace and understanding that our expectation is absolutely not that your students will be on for 8 hours a day. And providing opportunities for them to engage as well, if they are able to, but also allowing them to feel comfortable with the fact that they might not always be able to. They have other responsibilities and jobs to do and so forth, so that they don't feel the burden of having to carry that weight, but also feel that there is opportunities there for them to engage.
Excellent, thank you. So as we move through our conversation today, I think it's very clear that there are so many facets to this that does require a level of leadership in a school to actually make this work. So one of the things I'm wondering about, as schools are looking to shift to remote learning environments, what are some immediate steps they can take? So when we talk about extended school closures, we're talking about there may be a need, like we're experiencing right now today, there may be a need to rapidly make this shift. So what are some of the things that school leaders need to do, and how could they provide ongoing support to the students, the teachers, and parents throughout the duration of extended school closures? So we can look at it from two different kinds of perspectives. We can look at it from a school leader perspective, but then also, we've all been educators and been in the classroom and worked in schools, your traditional brick and mortars perhaps. And what would we need in those particular roles? If we think back, what would it be that teachers need from school leaders to actually make that kind of a shift? So I'll open up that to the group here, and then Jamey, maybe you and I could tackle some of the school level leadership from a perspective of an administrator. So Shannon, Stacey, any thoughts on what that could look like, or what you would desire that to look like as a teacher?
I would say clear and specific guidance as to what the expectations are as soon as they can possibly be available. Support and grace in allowing us to learn and grow and explore new tools, and know that we're not going to do them perfectly at first, and that concept of failing forward, all of that to be encouraged rather than the concern about things not going right. And as I think all of us as educators have seen, either in social media or other places, thinking about Maslow before Bloom, and knowing that we really need to focus on that social emotional side, not just the learning, what teachers need, how they need to be supported, and how our students need to be supported in times of emergency and high need.
I would say communication is key. So as Shannon pointed out, set clear expectations that you share with parents. If there's something that students are being asked to do outside of the physical classroom, make sure that you're very clear about those expectations and what you want students to accomplish or to get out of that learning. I would say too, when I think about younger students, it's very easy for us to get caught up in all of the tools that are out there right now, all of the bells and whistles. But a lot of times teachers have this, and this is better than a lot of the fancy tools out there. Make a video for your students of yourself reading a book. My youngest, their school has nightly reading with the superintendent right now. So he reads a book to all the kids. And so think about what you have at your fingertips. And I would really, really push you not to start using new tools during this time. Use what you have, use what you know, use what your kids know, because that's what they're used to. And that's how they're going to get through this. Not by implementing new tools that they don't understand, that parents have a hard time logging into, but what they've already been exposed to.
One last point, Dave had mentioned earlier, culture. And I think that plays a huge role in these kinds of transitions, making sure that you have developed a team culture, that we're in this together, we're all working on the same side to reach the same goal and same desire, but that culture could be a really critical piece in this type of transition.
Chris, I think Stacey and Shannon have done an outstanding job of trying to identify some of the key components. Obviously, the leadership of a building or a district has to, set the expectations, give grace, recognize that it's not going to be perfect day one, that we're all in this together. Stacey's comment about, let's not try a whole bunch of new tools and resources. All you have to do is jump online and see. It appears as though every organization out there that's got products and services is trying to, in their own way, help schools. I can imagine that many school leaders are feeling completely overwhelmed at this point in time. And I would just underscore the notion of, there's a big difference between trying to do some enrichment things during a short-term closure and things that might be a much bigger lift where it's an extended period of time. If the current mandate that we've got right now of school closures goes beyond a few weeks and starts to trickle into a couple of months, that likely will cause leadership in any district to think of a more of a lift and trying to do things that have more impact from an instructional standpoint. But Stacey's comment about trying to not infuse a whole bunch of new tools and strategies in such a short period of time, which will likely create undesirable stress for the students, for the parents, for the students as well, And I think it's this notion of trying to figure out how do you start doing some small things, build on those successes, and move forward.
And that will certainly vary from school district to school district based on their actual readiness. So in a long-term plan to shift to remote learning environments, for the purposes of learning continuity, that can build over time. And that's going to require some strategy and some structure. But just was mentioned earlier, that culture piece is a really big piece. And how a school actually maps out and executes that pathway to get there, that's going to be highly dependent on the culture. And culture is not something you can just develop overnight and say, okay, I want to put in a really great culture this week, next week, we're going to move on. It doesn't work that way. I think we all know that. When it comes to a rapid transition to remote learning environments, I think some of the things that we talked about here, be realistic and know where you are and how you can grow and at what pace. It's in an emergency situation where all learning has to move to be remote. There's a lot of other feelings and anxieties at play among all stakeholders, and that certainly has to be recognized as well. So, pulling together, I would say, a team, like a central command at the administrative level with some teacher representation, possibly even some student and parent representation if that's practical, and talk about what should this look like, and then certainly have that kind of ongoing communication as was already referenced. So if we could, let's talk about communications a little bit, and we did touch on it, and I appreciate that. But what are some of the ways, so let's say a school moves to a fully remote learning environment or mostly remote, where there's limited physical activity in a school building, for example. What ways are great ways to communicate with different stakeholders? And I'm talking about parents, teachers, and students. So that would be kind of like your internal stakeholders if we want to group them that way. But what about your external stakeholders, like community organizations and the community in general, businesses? Can somebody speak to different ways that we can communicate with these different kinds of stakeholders?
I think utilizing your school website, which all schools have these days, I have seen some really good communication coming out of social media, a lot of school Twitter accounts where they're providing quick updates and easy access updates for parents to follow. In addition to that, utilizing tools like Dave mentioned, Zoom is a great tool to be able to broadcast some messages and record yourself to be able to share out later, or similarly to what we're doing now.
So I would echo what Shannon said about social media, Facebook, the school district my kids are in uses Facebook to communicate a lot, and it actually brings community in, and we see more support from the community. I also think just simply email. For some parents, they may not have all of the devices with the apps and everything on it. So just having email to communicate and understanding that that's one way to get your message across. For the younger grades, I really like using Remind. It's a free text service, and so it's pretty easy for parents to sign up. Teachers can send messages to parents about expectations. They can send links to videos of teachers solving problems. I also think another one in that area is Seesaw. Seesaw is one that I really like using because there's a number of tools in one spot. And as a parent, I like it because it's very easy to find what I'm looking for, and it's easy to communicate with the teacher.
Chris, the only thing I would add is the frequency of updates. Instead of thinking, okay, well, we're going to provide updates, on Monday morning or Friday afternoon, smaller updates, but more frequently. And I think there's such a thirst right now for people to have information that during a closure, parents are going to want to have some more frequent pulse on what's happening and the things that the district wants to get out.
I agree with you completely, Jamey. in a lot of cases, this school will be a sense of stability for families, especially in a time of crisis. So I don't think we can underestimate or understate the importance of having those kinds of communications and regular updates. So, as we bring this particular conversation to an end, and we will have more for sure, we need to be sure that we understand the scope of the work that we're undertaking when we move to a remote learning model. And in a recent conversation Jamey and I had earlier, he shared some insights with me that I thought would be great to share with our community at large as we move forward in this progress. Jamey, would you be able to share some of those thoughts so that everybody viewing can have some insight into that conversation?
Sure, and I don't think these are anything magical, but they're trying to convey these in just a really practical sense. So we've heard it during this broadcast this afternoon, that this notion of setting and managing expectations as school leaders think about remote learning plans. Recognize that this is a point of stress for many in your community. You already know that. And helping to set the bar at the appropriate level, whether you're day 1 into the mandated closure or you're day 20 into the mandated closure. So setting those expectations, and then more importantly, managing those as you go through the closure period. Starting small, there are a lot of things that can be done with text messaging and an email that would have some instructional value and allow for kids to continue their engagement in education. It's been mentioned before, but it really recognizing that schools should be relying on those teachers that have already demonstrated some level of proficiency with remote learning. That's a huge asset that you have in your building or in your district. And to the extent that you don't want to, rely or lean on those people more than you can, but that's an asset that you should leverage and try to use. David talked earlier about, trying to do the train the trainer model, and so that's something you need to look at. Build on the smallest of successes. I'm just talking even micro level successes. So you've got a teacher who's been slow to use technology and they begin to use email, interacting with their kids. Celebrate that success, build on that. And then the last thing I would say is, even before the closure period that we've entered into, we recognize that all of our buildings are dealing with mental health challenges, whether it's the students, the staff, or our educators. And this COVID-19 situation has likely only worsened that in many, many different communities. And we need to be mindful of how do we figure out how to take care of each other. And so I think Stacey and Shannon both mentioned earlier this notion of it's all about relationships. It's all about relationships. Obviously, we're going to try to figure out how do we, during these closures, keep kids engaged and keep their minds active. But we also need to be really, really mindful of those mental health needs that all of us have, whether we're young or old. So those feel like really important things that we need to be mindful of as we help our kids during this extraordinary time of school closures.
Thank you, Jamey. And thank you to all of our panelists today. We really appreciate it. Stacey, Shannon, Dave, Jamey, much appreciated. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your experiences. I do want to communicate to all of our viewers here. We do have at Michigan Virtual several resources that we are going to be making available to you, some of which already are. First and foremost is the school closure learning continuity readiness rubric. That's what we were talking about today. That is available, and again, at the URL, the website listed below on this slide. It's already available now. We're currently working on something a little bit more specific to teaching, so you can expect to see that coming out very soon. We're also in the process of opening up some digital content for schools from Michigan Virtual Courses and making that available to help schools as they're looking for content to adapt and integrate into their existing models for remote teaching and learning. We're doing the same kind of a thing for professional learning and having training resources available for teachers, and certainly administrators can benefit from that as well. And we will also continue this webinar series. This is the first one that we're running that's specific to helping schools make this transition, but we're going to take a deeper dive into some of these categories and topics in future webinars. So that schedule will be released as soon as possible in the upcoming days. And again, all this information will be available at michiganvirtual.org/learning-community. And we also have a community of practice that we've launched through Facebook. We have over 1,400 people already as of this particular broadcast who have jumped on this. That's just within the past few days. It's a great place for educators, that's teachers, instructional support staff, administrators, to come in and share ideas, get ideas. And our general motto is take whatever it is that you need from the community and give whatever you can. So it's a great place for collaboration. And we are in the process this week of finishing up a draft of a more comprehensive guidance document called Learning Continuity, a planning guide for school leaders. And it's going to cover in more depth and give some very tangible things that you need to be talking about and thinking about in order to make your learning continuity planning most effective and actually implement a highly effective program there. Okay, so again, take a look at the Michigan Virtual website, the Learning Continuity section, that particular page, and you can get more details for that. So that being said, if you have any questions or thoughts or need a little extra guidance, feel free to reach out to me directly. That's my email address right there. Also, Twitter, you can reach out to Michigan Virtual in general or me directly through Twitter. So you see our IDs there. But thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate the time, and we certainly hope that this session was helpful to you. And if you have any thoughts or suggestions on other topics or other webinar recordings that we could do, feel free to reach out. We'd love to work with you on that. Thank you so much, and take care.